Okay, today we are going to look at factoring trinomials, and our focus today is the method of grouping. So this is our introduction to factoring trinomials, and there are many methods for trinomials, but today we are only going to focus on what we call grouping. We did that the other day with four-term polynomials, so it should look familiar, but it is a little bit different. Okay, so here is a problem like what you had the other day. Factor the following polynomial. It is four terms. So if we go to your sheet, first thing we're going to do is GCF. Well, here it goes. And then because it's four terms, we have to factor by grouping. So is there a GCF? What stands out to me is that all of these are divisible by 3. But then something else stands out that's kind of tricky to catch, but you have to make sure you look at it, is that our leading term is negative. So think back to when we did grouping just the other day. If your leading term is negative, then so is your GCF. So in this case, our GCF we know has to be a negative because the leading term is negative. And then what are all of these divisible by? Well, that would be 3. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to factor out the negative 3 from each term. So divide each term by negative 3. Really watch for sign changes. And that gets us to here. Now, the negative 3 is just going to tag along this whole time. But inside these parentheses, I have a 4-term polynomial, so I need to factor by grouping. The GCF of my first group is a 2x squared. And the GCF of my second group is going to be a negative, because the leading term is negative. And then the only thing that divides an x and a 4 is a 1. So now, bring my GCF along, and I'm going to change to a square bracket. You can do a parenthesis if you want to. But I'm going to pull these GCFs from each group, and I'm going to look at what do I have left. Well, 2x cubed divided by 2x squared is just x. 8x squared divided by 2x squared is 4. Negative x divided by negative 1 is a positive x. Negative 4 divided by negative 1 is a positive 4. So I've gotten my match, so it's looking pretty good so far. From here, again, bring that GCF down. Make sure you don't lose it. And now I'm going to regroup. One of my groups is going to be the 2 GCFs. The other group is going to be the match. And then I just need to double check. This one here still has a squared. Is it by chance a difference of 2 squares? And it's not. It's really close. But this 2 right here, that's not a perfect square. So that is not a difference of 2 squares, which just means this right here is my final answer. And remember that I can check it. Checking is going to be really key this chapter. So let's look at that real quick. I can either distribute the GCF to the first binomial, or I can multiply my 2 binomials together first and then do the GCF, which personally is what I tend to do, but you can do the GCF to the first binomial if you want. So if I distribute 2x squared times x, that's 2x cubed. 2x squared times 4x, well, that's an 8x squared. Negative 1 times x is negative x. Negative 1 times 4 is a negative 4. And then now if I distribute that negative 3, watch for sign changes. Let's see, is that the same answer as what we originally had? And it is. So that helps tell me for sure that I have factored correctly. Okay, so now we're going to look at, well, what happens if, let's see, I'm going to erase some of these other marks. I've pulled a GCF. And then what type of polynomial is it? Now it's a trinomial. And you can see the next step says, what method do you prefer? Well, we're going to teach you all three, and then eventually you get to look at which one you prefer. Today we're going to do grouping. So there's an example here. We're going to go through it step by step with some specific problems. So here's our first one. So is there a GCF in this one? Nope, no GCF. And we know that that's a possibility. Now, if we are going to factor by grouping, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this trinomial into a 4-term polynomial, and we're going to use what we call the big X. The top of your big X is always your A term times your C term. So in this case, that would give me a 12x squared. It's a very ugly X. Let's see if I can fix that. And the bottom of your big X will always be your B term. And we have to find the two sides. And what you're looking for is you're looking at what two numbers multiply to be, I'm supposed to be a dot, multiply to be a 12x squared and add to be a 7x. Well, if I try a 12x and 1x, that definitely multiplies to be 12x squared. But if I add 12x and 1x, that's a 13x, and I need a 7, so that's not it. So the next two numbers I know that multiply to be 12 are 3 and 4. And if I add those together, I also get 7x. So that's what tells you, like, okay, I've got these two numbers correct. So here's how we're going to transform our trinomial. What we're going to do is we're going to use that big X to split up our middle term. So the first term comes down. I'm going to split that middle term, and I'm going to keep the last term. Well, when I split, like, what does that mean? That means we're going to use the sides of this big X. So 3x and 4x. And it doesn't matter which one you write first. You can interchange them. Your work might be different than somebody who did it in a different order than you, but the final answer should be the same. Now that I have it written as a 4-term polynomial, I'm going to use grouping just like we did in our last lesson. Group the first two and last two. Identify the GCFs, and then factor those out. If I factor an x from my first group, x squared divided by x is x. 3x divided by x is 3. 4x divided by 4 is x. And 12 divided by 4 is 3. And look at that, I have the match. That's a key part of grouping. So now I'm going to regroup. The GCFs go in one group and the match goes in another, and that should be my answer. Remember, we can always check these very quickly. If I multiply that out, x times x is x squared, x times 3 is 3x, 4 times x is 4x, 4 times 3 is 12. Now this time I have like terms, and when I combine those, I'm given the original problem back. So that helps me know this right here is the correct factored form. Okay, we're going to do several examples of this together. Just know that it's really only the big X piece that's different from what you already know. So very little new information going on here. Number 2, first thing you look for is a GCF. This has one. The GCF is 2, so I'm going to factor it out. Divide every term by 2. just like in our previous lesson, that 2 out front is only going to hang out there. I just have to make sure I don't lose it. And my focus is inside here. If I'm going to do factor by grouping, my next step would be the big X. But one thing we have to make sure of is the GCF out front, I'm ignoring it for the moment. And when I'm setting up my big X, the top is the A term times the C term after the GCF has been pulled. So this is a minus 12x squared. And then this would be a 1x on the bottom because that's going to be your B term. So I'm looking for what two numbers multiply. I'm going to try to put a dot here. I kind of made this a little too small. Multiply to be 12x squared and add to be 1x. We're going to have to play with negatives a little bit. 6 and 2 isn't going to work. I can't add 6 and 2 and get 1. What I can do is I can take a 4x and a negative 3x. If I multiply those together, that gives me a negative 12x squared. And if I add them, that gets me a 1x. So now I need to factor by grouping. I'm going to keep my GCF out front. I don't want to accidentally lose it. And remember, it's right here that my focus is on. So I keep the first one, but it's the second term that I'm going to split up. And I'm going to split it up using the two sides of the big X. So I had a positive 4x and a negative 3x. And then I'm going to bring down my negative 12. Right, so the C comes down, the A comes down, and it's this middle term that's split in two. And I know that's messy because I kind of went through my big X, but you can always do your big X off to the side if that helps. Okay, factor by grouping. GCF of this first group would be X. GCF of the second group would be negative 3. I'm still going to keep this 2 so that I don't lose it. Now I'm going to factor out my GCFs, and I'm going to see if indeed I get the matching parts. X squared divided by x is x. 4x divided by x is 4. Negative 3x divided by negative 3 is a positive x. And negative 12x divided by negative 3 is a positive 4. I have the match, so that's good. So GCF and regroup. One of them's got to be the GCFs, and one of them's got to be the match. And there is my answer. I'm not going to check this one just for time, but you can multiply it out and you should end up with the original problem. Okay, let's move on to number 3. Number 3 does not have a GCF, so that step's gone. So we're going to start with our big X. Remember, the top of the big X is your A term times your C term. So that would give me negative 6x squared. And then the bottom of the big X is going to be 5x. So again, we're looking for multiplies to be to the top and adds to be the bottom. And that dot doesn't want to draw. It's supposed to be a dot up there. So let's see, 2 and 3. Now that adds to be a 5, but it doesn't multiply to be a negative 6. So I think we're going to have to go 6 and 1. But which of these would have to be negative in order to be adding to a positive 5x? Well, that would be the 1. Okay, so now I'm going to rewrite. Remember, keep the first term. I'm going to bring in those 2 extras and then, or the middle terms basically. So I have a plus 6x. And let's see, I'm going to change that plus sign to a minus 1x. Now I'm going to factor by grouping just like we've done quite often. This first GCF is a 2x. The second GCF is a negative 1. And I'm going to factor those out. Divide, and I get x plus 3. And divide my second group, and I also get x plus 3. So that's good news. And now I just regroup. One of these has to be the GCF, and one of these has to be the match. There we go. That's it. Now I can do a check real quick. Multiply that out. 2x times x is 2x squared. 2x times 3 is 6x. Negative 1 times x is negative 1x. And negative 1 times 3 is negative 3. And combine your like terms there. I get a plus 5x in the middle, which is exactly what we began with. So that helps me know that I am doing that problem correctly. All right, we've got two more. We'll kind of go through quickly. If you're doing this at home, pause the video and try these on your own, and then you can always hit play if you get stuck or if you want to check your answer. Okay, on 4, there's no GCF. So we're going to go straight to our big X. First times last, that's a bigger number. That's a 60x squared. And then the bottom is the middle term, so 16x. Well, what two numbers multiply to be 60x squared and add to be 16x? Well, that would be a 10x and a 6x. And I'm going to use that to rewrite my trinomial. Keep your first, and remember we're splitting the middle and keeping the last term. And the middle term gets split into the two sides of our big X, so 10x and 6x. Now group. GCF of this first group is a 2x. And the second group doesn't seem to have anything in common. So remember, when that happens, the only thing that they can both be divided by is a positive 1. I'm going to factor that from each group. Divide. And then divide again and say, hey, I've got the match. That's looking really good. And now regroup. And that should be my final answer here. If I've got time multiplied out, double check that it does indeed give you the answer you began with. For notes, I'm not going to do it, but it's always a really good idea to do, especially when you're quizzing and testing. All right, last one. This one does have a GCF. And again, here's that we talked about at the beginning of notes. If that very first term is negative, you know your GCF is negative. In this case, 32, 36, and 4 are all divisible by 4. So my GCF is a negative 4 out front. And when I divide each of those by negative 4, we get 8x squared minus 9x. And remember, negative 4 divided by negative 4 is 1. From here, I'm going to do my big X. I'm going to do it over here to the side. But I'm only focused on the values inside the parentheses because the GCF helps makes these numbers a lot smaller to work with. So I'm going to do 8x squared times 1. That's 8x squared. And then I've got a negative 9x here. So what multiplies to be 8x squared and adds to be 9x? Well, this one is kind of different. We haven't had an example exactly like this yet. But if I do 8x and 1x, that gives me 8x squared. But when I add those together, I get a positive 9x. Well, I need it to be a negative when I add and a positive when I multiply. So what we can do is we can actually make both of these negative. That's an absolute possibility. Multiplying two negatives still gives me a positive 8x squared. But now when I add them, I get that negative 9x that I've needed. Okay, so first thing we're going to do is rewrite. Keep the first term. I'm going to go ahead and bring in the two sides of the big X and then bring down your last term. And then you're going to group. GCF of my first group is an 8x. The second one is a negative because that first term's negative, but it's going to be a negative 1. Pull those GCFs from each group. Divide. 8x squared divided by 8x is x. Negative 8x divided by 8x is a negative 1. Negative 1x divided by negative 1 is a positive x. And positive 1 divided by negative 1 is a negative 1. And I've got my matching part, so that's great. So now we regroup. GCFs are going to go in one group, and the match is going to go in another. And that's my final answer. And again, to make sure this video is not too long, I'm not going to show the check, but you could multiply that out, and it should get your final answer. So try these on your homework, and make sure you guys ask for any help or clarification that you need.